Okay, so what we're going to do here is I'm going to finally review and I guess respond to Lex Fridman and Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson on Lex Fridman's podcast talking about, Lex asks him a question about his course on Nietzsche, his course on Beyond Good and Evil, which Peterson taught and which I've been very skeptical of because many of the things that Nietzsche says in Beyond Good and Evil directly contradict Jordan Peterson's interpretation of him, and so it just makes me suspicious to what degree Jordan Peterson has understood or even really read that book. But anyway, Lex asks him about it, and then they kind of go off topic. But so, full disclosure, I have seen this before. I didn't take any notes though. I just kind of watched it and let it, you know, marinate in my brain for a day or so. And I marked where the part that I really wanted to respond to happens. And so we'll start here.
What about not just profound thinkers, but thinkers that deliver a powerful idea? For example, utopian ideas of Marx or utopian ideas, you could say dystopian ideas of Hitler. Those ideas are powerful and they can saturate all your perception with values, and they they focus you in a way where there's only a certain set of actions.
Yeah, right. Even a certain set of emotions as well.
And it's intense and it's direct, and they're so powerful that they completely alter the perception and the words spring to life.
Yeah, it's like a form of possession. So there's two things you need to understand to make that clear. The first issue is that, as we suggested or implied, that perception is action predicated, but action is goal predicated, right? You act towards a goal. And these propagandistic thinkers that you described, they attempt to unify all possible goals into a coherent singularity. And there's advantages of that. There's the advantage of simplicity, for example, which is a major advantage. And there's also the advantage of motivation, right? So if you provide people with a simple manner of integrating all their actions, you decrease their anxiety and you increase their motivation. Now, that can be a good thing if the unifying idea that you've put forward is valid, but it's the worst of all possible ideas if you put forward an invalid unifying idea. And then you might say, well, how do you distinguish between a valid unifying idea and an invalid unifying idea? Now, Nietzsche was very interested in that, and I don't think he got that exactly right. But the postmodernists, for example, especially the ones, and this is most of them with the neo-Marxist bent, their presumption is that the fundamental unifying idea is power, that everything's about compulsion and force, essentially, and that that's the only true unifying ethos of mankind, which is, I don't know if there's a worse idea than that.
Okay, I mean, so anyone who has read Nietzsche to any depth should know why I'm already sort of triggered by this. Because, I mean, what did he say a second ago? He's like, this is what interested Nietzsche, was trying to come to some sort of grand unifying idea, not just a grand unifying idea, but a means for determining, rank ordering, right, what the better grand unifying ideas would be, how to distinguish, in Nietzsche's language, a healthy one from a sick one. This particularly interests Nietzsche around the time of his revaluation of values, which the Antichrist is the first book of. And near the beginning of that work, I believe it's in section 2, he offers sort of a notion of what is good, all that is power, all that increases power, all that increases the feeling of power in man, what is bad, weakness, practical sympathy with the weak and the botched, in a word, Christianity, right? And in Twilight of Idols, which is in the same year, so in the time period where Nietzsche's thinking about his revaluation of values, he says formula for our happiness, a yes, a no, a straight line, a goal. He also sort of confesses in his notes around this time, I've been a thoroughgoing nihilist until recently. What does he mean by that? I mean, Nietzsche's always been opposed to what he calls Schopenhauer's resignationism. He's been opposed to nihilism and a sort of the despairing, sort of the pessimism of weakness, right? Being pessimistic about life and then also saying no to life. Nietzsche's always been pessimistic about life and has always been sort of life affirming and saying yes to life in spite of this. So what does he mean when he says, I've nevertheless been a thoroughgoing nihilist until recently? Well, it's his realization that he has to have some sort of revaluation of values, some sort of self-legislation of what his values should be. You can't remain at the lion stage forever. You have to move on to becoming the creative child. And it's not just that Nietzsche, he can't just promote life affirmation in an abstract sense. To really legislate values, you need a grand unifying idea, as Peterson rightly points out. You need to be able to, in some sense, orient people's lives around how that happens. Again, a yes, a no, a straight line, a goal. To definitively say, this is life affirmation and this isn't. This is what leads to health, strength, power, etc. This is what does not. And Nietzsche, I mean, this is a sort of a, it's not really a contradiction or a paradox in Nietzsche, but it's one of the things that really drives people, I don't want to say drives them crazy, but confuses a lot of people when they first read Nietzsche, because they start to put these two things together, which are, they're really, could seem contradictory insofar as Nietzsche is a relativist, he's a perspectivist. The famous quotations like there are no facts, only interpretations of the facts. That's actually from his unpublished notes. What he actually says in his published work is there are no moral facts, only moral interpretations. Either way, it applies here because he is looking for a new morality, right? And so really the paradox, I think, is in language more than anything. Nietzsche has exposed that the objective truth value of moral systems that's something that you're never going to find. That's sort of a null value. There is no objective truth value of moral systems for the same reason, I mean, drawing on like the work of Spinoza, the various modifications of nature might have their version of what is good or bad, but speaking of good or bad in the absolute sense doesn't really make any sense because you run into the problem of the good of the lion and the good of the gazelle, right? How they're mutually exclusive. And so in order to square that circle, basically, Nietzsche accepts the mutually exclusive and perspectival nature of values. He accepts that no, the what would we say, the ends that serve the Athenians and the ends that serve the Spartans might actually be contradictory and might actually come into conflict with one another, right? So you can't say that any one of these specific ways of valuing is correct, quote unquote, in the sense of absolute truth. But you could make statements about whether they are, as he says in Beyond Good and Evil, life preserving, life promoting, species rearing. And so that's what Nietzsche tries to anchor his revaluation of values to. There's been controversy as well as to whether or not Nietzsche actually thought that this was, like whether this was a project he was actually going to follow through on. There's some indication he might have abandoned the project. We'll never know because he had his collapse in, into dementia or rapid onset dementia. And so he would have been unable to finish the project whether or not he wanted to. The point being, there is, you can accept the perspectival nature and relativity of all systems, all sorts of moral systems of thought, but then you can also, and this is maybe a very interesting way to get at it, as the 1001 Goals passage from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, evaluate the ways in which all of those systems, you could ask the question, what were they all aiming at? And the way Nietzsche gets at it in the 1001 Goals, Zarathustra speaks of like a tablet of values that hung over all mankind. He talks about the Greeks. It's said that the friend should always be the rival, the one who encourages you to outstrive all others. And the Persians had this set of values, and the Hebrews had this set of values, and so on and so forth. And what Zarathustra says is that all of these moralities were ways of man overcoming himself. What does that mean? Well, when you adhere to a moral code, every moral code that exceeds like the most basic hedonism of I'll just sort of do whatever I want, whenever I want to, follow every impulse, satisfy every impulse immediately, which is arguably the way an animal lives. If you adopt any sort of standard for your action, that requires that you overcome yourself in that way, that you overcome your immediate impulses, that a feeling be able to wait. And how does that happen if that is the nature of every feeling, to be every impulse to be discharged and satisfied immediately? If the feeling is to be able to wait, then a feeling must be able to be dominated by a thought. And so that is sort of the great overcoming of mankind and Nietzsche talks about this a great deal in the genealogy of morals, the way in which mankind sort of imposed through discipline and punishment, really, the ability of the human animal to remember and thus to make promises and thus to be held to those promises at a future date, right? And you could also tie this in with Nietzsche's conception of like the pre-moral age, the moral age, and then he hopes for a coming extra moral age. And the coming extra moral age, what would that be? Well, that is Zarathustra's 1001 goals. That is the recognition of overcoming morality by seeing the nature of morality, that each one of those tablets of values hanging over mankind was a contingent thing, a relative thing, a perspectival thing, something that sprung into being according to the conditions of what fostered that people's survival or their flourishing. And Nietzsche also brings up the point of how they contrasted themselves with their enemies or their neighbors. He also talks about this in the genealogy, the pleasure of knowing oneself different. So there are all of these factors that gave rise to these contingent individual moralities, but what were all of them doing? Nietzsche's conclusion is will to power, because will to power, as we know from Zarathustra, when life speaks, life herself speaks, she says, I am that which overcomes itself, and that my whole content, everything, my whole story is will to power. So that's what will to power is. Now, why did I go on this long discourse to say that Jordan Peterson is wrong? He says there's not an idea that's worse or more reprehensible than to reduce everything to power, but that's precisely what Nietzsche does. And he is going to, if I recall correctly, he's going to make a point briefly that that's not what Nietzsche was doing. But I guess preemptively, before we get there, that's incorrect. That is what Nietzsche is doing. He's saying your value system, your morality, all of those things that those virtues that were extolled, so like we might say in the Christian morality, like chastity, charity, humility, and so on, these are not eternal virtues, right? They are all contingent on the will to power. All of those were a means of expanding power, of either of the civilization or of a ruling class in that civilization, or whatever it might be. And it might be difficult to see that, but the way Nietzsche talks about it in The Gay Science, for example, is that morality itself, so it praises selflessness, but actually this is very selfish from the point of view of, like, it's selfish from the point of view of the collective of the society, instrumentalizing the individual members to get them to basically abnegate or self-abnegate or sort of give up, instrumentalize themselves, become tools of the collective, become tools of the broader society. And it actually serves the benefit of the lowest common denominator, the average person, to get all the exceptions to the rule to forestall or suppress acting on impulses or values that they have, or even they might even be intellectually well articulated and very well thought out moral goals, but if they clash with the morality of the collective, the overall culture, the herd, as Nietzsche would say, we call that wrong and bad and evil and so on and so forth. We call that selfish. You're acting in your self-interest against the interest of the collective. So my point in bringing this up, whether you buy that argument or not, is that something like promoting the value of chastity or charity, you might say, well, how does that expand the will to power? Well, it doesn't expand an individual's will to power, but it might be a way of ordering society so that the whole collective has greater power by making each member less selfish and more willing, like ants, willing to sacrifice themselves or sacrifice their own well-being or happiness for the greater good. So, and like Islam might be an example of this, not just Christianity, right? Islam might demand all of these things that make you, humble and give to the poor and, don't aspire to anything worldly beyond, don't aspire to anything other than the love of God, submission to God. But what does that do? It might create a society that's a really strong, cohesive unit, Ibn Khaldun, Asabiya. But the point is that Nietzsche does actually trace all of this back to power. He says that's why those values obtain, that's why they succeed. The reason why the tablet of values hanging over the Persians endures for so long is because it made the Persians powerful. The reason why that tablet of values that hung over the Greeks sustained them and made the Greeks everything they are is because it made the Greeks powerful. It was a way of their self-overcoming, becoming something greater than themselves. And because that's ultimately what power means. And uh, that's sort of the problem though with Jordan's analysis. He's like Nietzsche doesn't want to reduce everything to power, or saying, oh, Nietzsche had a grand unifying theory. I don't think he got it quite right. But these postmodernists who want to reduce everything to power, that's like wicked and reprehensible and blah blah blah. He I'm not going to arbitrate or litigate over whether or not somebody like Foucault falls under, whether he's accurately describing them, but I will say he is accurately describing what Nietzsche says. Nietzsche does, in fact, say that power is the impetus of all of these things. And so when Peterson then brings in other values, as I've seen him do in other sources, other interviews, talking about what about merit? What about discipline? What about conscientiousness? What about all of these other things? What about creativity? What about productivity? Yeah, well, you fundamentally disagree with Nietzsche if you think those are like separate values that don't ultimately reduce to power. He would say, yes, they do. Yes, they do. The whole world is will to power and nothing besides, is what Nietzsche says. So let's continue.
I mean, there are ideas that are potentially as dangerous. The nihilistic idea is pretty dangerous, although it's more of a disintegrating notion than a unifying idea. The hedonistic idea that you live for pleasure, for example, that's also very dangerous. But
Yeah, and just a quick point, I don't want to belabor this. The nihilistic idea, it's very interesting the way that Jordan talks about this because he talks like a guy who has never read Nietzsche. I'm not saying that he's expressing Nietzsche's view here, but like, what is the nihilistic idea? Like, is he just talking about depressed people or like there's no meaning to life, there's no point? Who cares? No one lives like that. I mean, maybe some people do, but usually there's some sort of consciously articulated moral in addition to that. Even if it's last man morality, right? Do as little harm as possible, be as comfortable as possible, so on and so forth. Very few people are just completely nihilistic, and those people, like the what would we say, like the Dylan Klebold, Aaron Harris people in the world, who would go and commit a crime like that to just wantonly take life for no reason. Usually, they have some sort of, psychotic break. They have some sort of problem. They're trying to take revenge on the world, but that's not the majority of people who are just sort of like, oh, life has no meaning. The reason why I'm bringing this up at all is because Nietzsche would say there are many forms of nihilism, and one of them is Christianity, because it aims at what happens to you after death. That's where it directs your focus. Nietzsche would say so many of the modern ideologies that Jordan Peterson promotes are secret paths to nothingness. And it's just interesting that he never really confronts that. He talks about how Nietzsche tries to struggle with nihilism, but he doesn't say what did Nietzsche say nihilism was? Why are we nihilistic? Because of 2,000 years of Christianity. Nietzsche says this explicitly.
if you wanted to go for sheer pathology, the notion that, and this is Foucault in a nutshell, and Marx for that matter, that power rules everything, not only is that.
No, not Marx. Marx doesn't say that. Marx is an economist. I'm not a Marxist, guys, but like, I always feel like I have to play Marx's advocate, probably in a similar way to that I have to play Nietzsche's advocate against leftists. But so many conservatives, they haven't read Marx ever, and their conception of Marx is childish. That's not what Marx says. Marx doesn't say everything reduces to power. He would say material conditions, material relationships, which are ultimately economic relationships, which somebody like Nietzsche might come along and say is power. Sure. And yeah, he's correct that the postmodern neo-Marxists, people like Foucault, took Nietzsche and introduced Nietzsche into leftist thought and did create this power discourse, which I would say is probably more honest in some ways than classical Marxism. But Foucault rejected Marxism and eventually became like a libertarian, I believe. So is he really a good example?
That a terrible unifying idea, but it fully justifies your own use of power. And I don't mean the power Nietzsche talks about.
What is it that justifies your use of power, Jordan? Is it saying everything is a naked power game? Because that means no power is justified, no power is unjustified. Justifying your use of power would be saying something like, my power, my position of authority and social standing that I have is based on my merit, on my worth. That would be a justification for the use of your power. Am I saying that's bad? No. I mean, that's human. We all justify ourselves. We all speak a philosophy in the language of that's relative to our perspective, according to who and what we are. So of course, the people who have no social standing and no authority and no power in society will say, well, this is all just a naked power game, and it's just the same whether I take up power or you do. And of course, the people who hold that power will say, no, it's legitimate. I have this power because I earned it and I deserve it, and you don't. And this goes all the way back to, I mean, Nietzsche says that's the beginning of the French Revolution, when the Ancien Regime basically no longer was able to make that argument. But it's not the fault of the masses, the underclass, that you can't make that argument. Nietzsche says it's your fault in Human All Too Human, book 2, I believe, where he says that the socialistic heart itch and the revolutionary urge exists in you, the rich, and your your ostentatious spending and your inability to be virtuous and your inability to project that same kind of authority, that dignitas, to use the Roman term, which doesn't just mean dignity, it's a very specific meaning, like the status, the what would we say, sort of like the privileges that you are owed, right? Anyway, power always justifies itself. Or maybe not. I mean, Nietzsche would say that like the barbarians, right, or like people who were acting in the state of nature, where it was more like a raw force against force, you know, Caesar versus Vercingetorix. That image probably comes to mind because the Weltgeist video uses that image. Shout out to my friend Weltgeist, but it's a perfect example where he made a video called Don't Argue, Command, right? There is a sense in which having to justify yourself, having to give reasons, is already sort of like reactive, and we wouldn't say that every human being throughout all history felt like they had to justify themselves and to give reasons. But in modern day society, when we're talking about power dynamics between, say, the rich and the poor, and we all exist within this sort of liberal democratic free market society that's been subjected to the theoretical worldview and the dialectic and Christianity and Platonism for thousands of years, yeah, everyone kind of justifies themselves. We don't live in the state of nature, right? If we ever return to that, yes, we will return to the point where people don't have to justify themselves. But yeah, that's just sort of what happens, Jordan. But he's ignoring that the people who hold power now will use. You don't think morality is a justification for people imposing power?
His will to power was more his insistence that a human being is an expression of will rather than a mechanism of self-protection and security. Like,
an expression of will rather than a method of self-protection and security or something like that. So yeah, Nietzsche's will to power overcoming Schopenhauer's will to live. Correct. What does it mean to say they're an expression of will, though? Will towards what? Because just saying will is like saying desire, aiming, moving towards. Moving towards what? Nietzsche says explicitly, power, more power, the feeling of power. And what does he say about it? Power is the feeling that resistance is being overcome, which is certainly, that is certainly not, what would we say, the feeling that resistance is being overcome. Jordan will try and sort of discount that this has a domineering or tyrannical aspect, but Nietzsche explicitly says that it does. Like, people will always try and exclude this. I mean, Kaufman is kind of guilty of this, of promoting this misunderstanding by trying to really focus in on, oh, Nietzsche, his will to power, it doesn't have to do with dominating others. It has to do with mastering yourself. Yes, that is part of it. But it doesn't exclude dominating others. Or else why, if that was the case, then why would Nietzsche's will to power be a grand unifying idea for how all life behaves? if it didn't explain half of the story, or you could easily argue more than half. If you leave out a significant, like a lot of life is dominating and tyrannizing and exploiting. And Nietzsche says that's what nature is. It's the Sipo Matador passage in Beyond Good and Evil, right? And I've talked about this a lot lately, so go look it up. I did a whole episode on it. Nietzsche's very clear. He says tyranny is too soft a word for it. We don't actually have a word that describes the true nature of power, that it is command and obedience. Nietzsche's explicit about this. So why would it be that, yes, he's talking about being able to command yourself and obey yourself, but Nietzsche includes this. And again, is that an endorsement? Not necessarily. I mean, it can be with Nietzsche, but the point is that it's descriptive. When he's giving his will to power idea, it's a meta-ethic. And so when in trying to leave this out and sanitize Nietzsche in this way, I don't know. It makes me suspicious of his interpretation.
Like, he thought of the life force in human beings as something that strived not to protect itself, but to exhaust itself in being and becoming.
This is true.
It's like an upward oriented motivational drive,
Yes.
even towards meaning. Now, he called it the
Even
will
towards
to power.
meaning. No, not towards meaning. Meaning, in the way that Jordan is using it, is like a Platonic idea, a Platonist idea. That's not what Nietzsche's aimed at. Meaning is something that exists in consciousness. That's something that the consciousness needs. What does Nietzsche say about consciousness? It's a superficial world. It's a surface and sign world. Consciousness reveals something, like the skin reveals something, but it conceals even more. That the conscious world is a mendacious and false world, a world of vulgarizations and generalizations, a world of concepts that equates unequal things. That's the world where we have these debates about meaning. But Nietzsche says life as it exists could continue and propagate itself without seeing itself in a mirror, as it were, in spite of how upsetting that might be to the old philosophers. I forget exactly how he puts it. So, no, we don't actually need to see... Life itself does not need meaning, doesn't aim for meaning. Now, you might say human life does, and that you might point to that Nietzsche passage where he says, he who has a Y can bear any how. Yes, because that's the human condition as conscious beings, right? So that's one of the things that we look for. But a lot of this, okay, Jordan should have maybe read The Gay Science as well. I'm sure he would claim he's read it, but, in The Gay Science, Nietzsche sort of says that life itself, that the metaphysicians of all ages have always been trying to give man a reason for being, but that life itself will continue to propagate anyway, because that's what life does in absentia of reasons. It propagated before there were beings such as us, clever animals that invented knowledge, and it will continue to propagate itself if there is no reason for being. And that this is sort of like that's like the will to deception is really what Nietzsche says, that our search for meaning is a way of like deceiving ourselves within this false world of consciousness as a way of mitigating the flaw that consciousness represents. And is Nietzsche like anti-consciousness? Not in a moral sense, but he does say that whatever is done consciously cannot be done perfectly. And the more self-conscious we are, the more damaged we are in some sense, the less innocent we are as life forms. This is part of Nietzsche's idea of forgetting, and the idea that knowledge kills action, and that being able to, in the moment of action, we have to sort of forget, and that forgetting is an active and positive force that sort of clears away the pathologies of the conscious system that hold on to the sense impressions and then cause things like resentment and bad conscience and so on. That consciousness is prone to all of these problems, like resentment and bad conscience. And Nietzsche's great dream is a consciousness that overcomes that. And so that's like a realm where, yes, consciousness might create something like a story that generates meaning. That's exactly as false and mendacious as everything else within the world of consciousness. And it's a way of overcoming the flaws that consciousness has so that the life form can flourish. But what's the ultimate goal there? flourishing, the life advancing itself, life discharging itself, as Jordan correctly points out. So again, it does reduce to power. Meaning is a way of achieving power. It's not, in Nietzsche's view, that's life creating this whole story, a narrative of meaning, metaphysics, morality, so on and so forth. That's a way of seducing us to continue living and continue propagating ourselves, continue to be willing to I've been putting it in Schopenhauerian language. It's much easier usually just to get these ideas across. It's an unfortunate, maybe it's just a bad habit of mine. But we might say that to get you to sacrifice yourself for a great goal, which is what life really wants out of you, and which is the real way to advance the species, right? In order to do that, life may have to deceive you. But the ultimate goal is not the meaning, right? Jordan would say the ultimate goal is to find this meaning. But what does that mean? It would mean finding some sort of intelligibility to the world, some sort of understanding of what the why is in our existence. And that's the raison d'etre of living, right? Which is Socratic. It's life as a means to knowledge, life as a means to truth. And again, I can't talk about this without injecting every nuance, because Nietzsche himself also talked about life as a means to knowledge being a great boon to him. But again, that's a statement Nietzsche makes that's very self-aware of the fact that because it's in the same book, it's in The Gay Science, it's that he's crafting a narrative within the superficial side world in order to promote life. Again, everything is aimed at in Nietzsche's philosophy is in fact power. It does reduce down to power, as Jordan would put it. Meaning is not the goal of the will to power.
That's had some
It's Jordan's
unfortunate
goal.
consequences. At least that's how it's translated. But he didn't mean the power motivation that people like Foucault or Marx became so hung up on.
So it's not power like you're trying to.
That's just wrong. I mean, it's wrong in the sense that Foucault and Marx, that Marx believed in that view of power, which I think you'd be hard pressed to derive a reading of Marx that says that. But what he's implying is that what Nietzsche was saying, that his will to power concept doesn't include, again, dominating, exploiting, oppressing people, which it does. It does.
Destroy the other. It's powerful flourishing of a human being, the creative force of a
What if that
human
requires
being.
you to destroy the other?
You could imagine that, and you could imagine that you could segregate competence and ability. Like, imagine that
This
you
has
and I were
nothing
going
to do
to
with
work on a
Nietzsche.
project. We could organize our project in relationship to the ambition that we wanted to attain, and we can organize an agreement so that you were committed to the project voluntarily, and so that I was committed to the project voluntarily.
Which again, Nietzsche, this has nothing to do with Nietzsche. He would say, no, these relationships are established based on command and obedience. And why would anyone ever come to an agreement like Jordan's describing? Well, Nietzsche does say, when parties of relatively equal strength encounter each other, they sometimes strike agreements like this. Because in the same way that two predatory animals don't want to get into a fight, they might try and intimidate one another, but usually they might fight for a little bit and run away, or they just make an intimidation display. Usually it doesn't come to that unless there's like an actual existential struggle for a feeding ground or something like that. More often, so really what Nietzsche's getting at is there is no social contract. People don't ever sit down and voluntarily agree, I will fulfill this role of the society and you will fulfill yours, and on this equal basis. Because how would you ever have that equal basis within the state of nature? You would need to have two parties of relatively equal strength who both calculated it's not worth it for us to fight, so we should strike some sort of agreement. That's what Nietzsche actually says. He doesn't say that we establish these relationships of competence and ability or something like that. That's Jordan's idea. It's not Nietzsche's idea.
So that means that we would actually be united in our perceptions and our actions by the motivation of something approximating voluntary play. Now, you could also imagine another situation where I said, here's our goal, and you better help me or I'm going to kill your family. Well, the probability is that you would be quite motivated to undertake my bidding. And so then you might say, well, that's how the world works. It's power and compulsion. But
I mean, how does Jordan account for that? I mean, Nietzsche, or how does Jordan say that that's not accounted for under Nietzsche's will to power understanding, right? I mean, really, what it sounds kind of Hegelian. I'm sure Peterson doesn't like Hegel, but he's really touching dangerously close on the master-slave dialectic here of like, that might be a form of power, but that's like low level. And as we become more conscious and you know, there's a greater revelation of the absolute, then we come to realize the ways in which that relationship is unsatisfactory or something like that. I don't know. Let's see what he says. I don't remember exactly what he says.
The truth of the matter is that you can force people to see things your way, let's say, but it's nowhere near as good a strategy, even practically, than the strategy that would be associated with something like voluntary joint
Why not?
agreement of pattern of movement strategy.
Why is that not a better strategy? I don't know. I guess that takes us away from Nietzsche. I'm not saying there's no argument, but where do you find that argument in Nietzsche is kind of what I'm saying.
Towards a goal. See, this is such an important thing to understand because it helps you start to understand the distinction between
kind of argument.
A unifying force that's based on power and compulsion and one that is much more in keeping, I would say, with the ethos that governs Western societies, free Western societies. There's really a qualitative difference, and it's not some morally relativistic illusion.
So if we just look at the...
Right, so that goes far beyond Nietzsche. And again, Jordan might just be he's just kind of talking here. He's kind of riffing on his own ideas. Fair enough, but Nietzsche was a critic of what Jordan calls free Western democratic societies. For one, he would say they're not actually free. He says we'll make all the pretense of saying dignity of man, dignity of labor, even as the laborers and the human beings at the bottom rung are crushed under the wheels of industry. He would say that try as they might, the anarchists never actually destroy power. In fact, they bring about the most vicious tyrannies. Jordan would probably agree with that, but why would he think that it would be any different when it comes to democracies, right? And again, that only works if you bring in these sort of Enlightenment ideals that Nietzsche's entire career is based on a criticism of, criticizing the potency of the dialectic, criticizing the capacity for humankind to actually sort of like transcend what Jordan would call these naked relationships of power and exploitation.
Nuance of Nietzsche's thought. The idea he first introduced in Thus Spoke Zarathustra of the Ubermensch.
Yeah.
That's another one that's very easy to misinterpret because it sounds awfully a lot like it's about power.
Yeah, right.
For example, in the 20th century, it was
is.
misrepresented and co-opted by Hitler to advocate for the extermination of the inferior.
Right, which is a misreading, because I don't need to go into that as well. I also did a whole episode on Nietzsche contra fascism, where you can look at how that's a misinterpretation. I mean, like the Nazis, just to give you one example, they would refer to the German soldiers, like in the Nazi education system, they were like, yeah, the German soldiers storming the trenches in World War I, those were Ubermenschen, because they overcame their self-preservative instinct. So the soldiers, the people, the party men, people that Nietzsche said he distrusted fundamentally, people who instrumentalize themselves and make themselves into a cog in a collectivist machine, they're actually the Ubermensch. That's a total misunderstanding. So, correct, that's not right. But Lex is saying something like, oh, it seems like the Ubermensch is all about power. Yeah, and the Ubermensch is a metaphor, an allegory, an embodied ideal, a vision of the future, potential future of mankind. The idea being man is a bridge and not a goal. So seeing life as something moving, something ascending or descending potentially, but that we're not a final form. Mankind, the rational animal, we were not created as a Platonic form. We were not created in the perfect image of God. We're a thing that evolved. We're a thing that came into being from presumably life forms that were not as advanced, not as powerful, not as complex, such as the ape. And what could the next iteration be that's so far along in that process in the future that isn't even human anymore in the sense that we are now? What would be something even better than that? But again, it is at the end of the day, that is aimed at the increase of power of mankind. And a lot of that involves things we mentioned earlier, like the shedding of guilt and bad conscience and ressentiment, the ascetic ideal.
Non-Aryan races.
Yeah, and the dominion of the superior Aryans. Yeah, and yeah, well, and that was partly because Nietzsche's work also was misrepresented by his sister after his death. But definitely, but I also think that there's a fundamental flaw in that Nietzschean conceptualization. So Nietzsche, of course, famously announced the death of God, but he did that in a manner that was accompanied by dire warnings, like Nietzsche said, because
And we're
people
going back
tend
to
to think
this.
of that as a triumphalist statement. But Nietzsche actually said that he really said something like the unifying ethos under which we've organized ourselves psychologically and socially has now been fatally undermined by, well, by the rationalist proclivity, by the empiricist proclivity. There's a variety of reasons. Mostly it was conflict between the Enlightenment view, let's say, and the classic religious view. And
So I just want to, okay, a couple things. When he says Nietzsche didn't announce the death of God as a triumphalist statement, in the madman passage in The Death of God, it is a madman speaking to people who are themselves atheists. So think about this from the perspective of like Kierkegaard or Pascal. They're Christians who criticize Christianity, criticize other Christians. Nietzsche is an atheist criticizing other atheists. So speaking to them, to that audience, through the mouth of a fictional character, the madman, he says, like, don't you realize, basically, all we've lost? And I've discussed this at length, the things that he says in Will to Power that Christianity gave mankind. That, again, over 2,000 years of working on the psychology gives us a meaning for our suffering. It gives us a ability to endure that suffering thereby. It gives a meaning to evil, right? It says that the reason why you suffer all of these things at the hands of evil people, there's a reason behind it, something, so on and so forth. Again, that's in the morals phase of mankind, the consciousness sort of overcoming the pathologies and limitations of consciousness through the will to deception, right? And so Nietzsche then accordingly tries to give us a new narrative, a new meaning, a new way of overcoming that would be more aimed at the worldly, that would be more commensurate with his idea of the will to power, which is a grand unifying idea that reduces everything down to power. But it is triumphalist when Nietzsche is speaking to his free spirits, people who understand him. He says, our hearts overflow with gratitude at the news that the old God is dead, because never before such a wide open sea existed. And I just want to say, it's like everything Jordan just said about like, well, what Nietzsche really said was something about the rationalist proclivity, blah, 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 blah. It's just amazing to me that he can take, it reminds me of when he was debating Zizek, and Zizek said, God himself was an atheist at the moment when Jesus was on the cross, as he cries out, God, why have you forsaken me? And that like blew Jordan's mind in that debate. You could tell he was like, oh my God, that's like a point I would make. That's amazing. Zizek actually has some good points, And, he's written like Christian atheism and things like that. But the idea that like for God to really enter the condition of man, God would also have to doubt. God would also have to be a skeptic. God would also have to not know that God exists to really be a human being. And that's sort of the great flaw with the Jesus story, the way Christians present it, of like, look at everything God did for you. God died for you. He sacrificed himself for you. It's like, well, not really. He incarnated into flesh, and then at the end of it, he gets to be God. So, it's like a temporary inconvenience for an all-powerful being. I don't know. Like, would you not take that deal? You endure everything Jesus endures, but at the end of it, you get to be God? And, so it's sort of like, now imagine going through everything that Jesus endures, but you don't know at the end of it, you're going to be God. You're just like a person like everyone else, just suffering, right? So it is kind of a flaw in the story, and that's why it's a very beautiful sort of like squaring of that circle to say, no, even then, even at the moment when Jesus is about to die, that's when he cries out, says, God, why have you forsaken me? Even God himself was an atheist. Kenosis is the term, self-emptying, that he even emptied himself of the knowledge that he was God. That maybe he had the intuition, but he couldn't be sure, like absolutely sure. I don't know. There's a bunch of different ways people interpret that scene. I mean, like the Gnostics had their interpretations of it that are considered heretical or whatever. There's various ones, but and I'm sure Christian apologists would have different ways of interpreting it and wouldn't like my interpretation. But point being, why did I bring that up? Oh, so Zizek said that God himself was an atheist on the cross. It's like, it's very Nietzschean, right? Saying what you could say in a whole sentence and or in a whole like paragraph and putting it into a little poetic sentence. And then I saw a clip where Jordan was like trying to paraphrase what Zizek said to an audience of his followers. And he like turned it into like pseudo-intellectual gobbledygook, where he was like, and Zizek told me that, you know, that even God himself, upon the full perception of taking in the suffering and abject state of the human condition, even he would cry out in, like ignorance and like, it was like he couldn't just repeat what Zizek said, or he couldn't summarize it in a way that didn't completely like butcher the succinct, beautiful poetry of what Zizek said. It's like, why? We get it when Zizek says it in a sentence, right? And so the death of God passage, it's like, is what Jordan really just said there any more elucidating than saying, who gave us the sponge to wipe away the horizon? Who gave, like, how could what is holiest and noblest among us have bled to death under our knives? I don't know. That's not really me making a point about his argument. It's just criticizing his rambling lecture style.
That there will be dire consequences for that. And Nietzsche knew, like Dostoevsky knew, that, see, there's a proclivity for the human psyche and for human societies to move towards something
he really has a proclivity for using the word proclivity.
Approximating a unity, because the cost of disunity
I probably have words
is
like
high.
that too that you guys know.
Fractionation of your goals. So that means you're less motivated to move forward than you might be, because there's many things competing for your attention. And also anxiety, because anxiety actually signals something like goal conflict. So there's an inescapable proclivity of value systems to unite. Now, if you kill the thing that's uniting them, that's the death of God, they either fractionate and you get confusion, anxiety, and hopelessness, or you get social disunity, or something else arises out of the abyss to constitute that unifying force. And Nietzsche said specifically that he believed that one of those manifestations would be that of communism, and that would kill, he said this in Will to Power, that would kill tens of millions of people.
He's mostly right about this. I would just say his reading is a little bit stretched. Nietzsche does say he predicts the future of the coming centuries, in the next 2 centuries, and says that, you know, millions will die in wars and that it'll be struggles over values. I don't think Nietzsche specifically says communism will arise and kill millions of people. You know, maybe it's close enough. But I mean, I should just say it's not like he predicted communism. There was already socialism was already, the Communist Manifesto had already been written. Socialism, communism, these were very real movements. Nietzsche's not really predicting anything. I mean, I guess you could say he might be predicting that this would be one of the movements that would come up, spring up and create a new idol. He just as much predicted nationalism and fascism would do so. But I don't know. I think it's a little stretched, but we'll give him this. Mostly, I would say true, like 90% true.
In the upcoming 20th century, like he could see that.
Sorry, another point though is that bad for Nietzsche from his perspective? Like, if the old God is dead, like truly dead, can we go back to that? And Nietzsche would say, like, no, if that belief, literally, we cannot bring ourselves to believe in it anymore, some other god, some other idol will rise up and will become the thing that people sacrifice towards, some new ideal, right? And we have to have a struggle over the new ideals. Like, there's no getting out of that. And, you know, I don't know, was that bad? Like, does Jordan think it was bad that the old dynastic, like, theologically justified monarchies of Europe fell? Because, like, we did actually eventually have that value struggle, and it would seem, I mean, history is beginning again, but at least at the point of the post World War II, it seemed like liberal democracy mostly won that struggle. You know, was that bad for that struggle to happen? Like you could argue that a lot of the prosperity in the wake of the war had to do with the fact that there was a war, right? That established this sort of like American dominance over global trade and everything. And like, again, if you're like a Marxist or anti-imperialist, you think that's all terrible. But from Jordan's perspective, that should all be like a good thing, right? That doesn't mean it's good that the Holocaust happened or whatever, or like that millions died in World War II. But like, if that was necessary, that struggle had to happen, that there was going to be millions dead in a struggle over what the new values, the new ideals will be. I guess what I'm saying is like, does he really think like, well, it would have been better if we had never questioned the existing hierarchies at all, if the French Revolution had never happened, Rousseau had never written, um, you know, then you would have never had the opportunity for a liberal democratic world order. So like, and that is very much key to Nietzschean thought. It's not, I don't know, like this whole way of thinking of like, I want the fruit but not the flower, or like I want the end product but the birth pangs. I want the baby, I don't want the labor pangs. That's the attitude that he imputes onto Nietzsche when he suggests that Nietzsche thought the death of God was a terrible calamity. It's not a terrible calamity. It's the birth pangs of something new. That's Nietzsche's attitude. It's not this lamenting, oh, woe is me, the death of God. Um,
That coming 50 years earlier. Dostoevsky did the same thing in his book, The Demons. So this is the thing that the a-religious have to contend with. It's a real conundrum because, I mean, you could dispute the idea that our value systems tend towards a unity, and society does as well, because otherwise we're disunified. But the cost of that disunity, as I said, is goal confusion, anxiety, and hopelessness. So it's like a real cost. So you could dispense with the notion of unity altogether, and the postmodernists did that to some degree. But they pulled off a sleight of hand too, where they replaced it by power. Now Nietzsche he's responsible for that to some degree, because Nietzsche said, with his conception of the overman, let's say, is that human beings would have to create their own values, because the value structure that had descended from on
Source. Where does Nietzsche say that? Jordan repeats this line all the time. I kind of am interested in like what the basis of this reading is. I mean, he does talk about the self-legislation of values. But what he says is that all values, every thou shalt was once an I will. Now, does that mean that somebody created it out of the ether? So Jordan thinks that values creation is like something that happens in this platonic, intelligible world of ideals. But the nature of values to Nietzsche is that they're physiological. He says behind logic and its seeming sovereignty of movement stand valuations, which is to say physiological demands for the preservation of a certain way of life. So Nietzsche would say, I don't know, all of the previous values were an impulse, a drive, some sort of goal that was set by an I will, that was created actively and eventually obtained over a culture, a people, a society, an entire civilization, whatever the case may be. And what is the mechanism for that? Is it that they just like wanted it really bad? Well, no, because values are constantly being tested in the relationships of tension and the contests of force that go on in the world. And that's really what Nietzsche's talking about when he's talking about a revaluation of values. What does it mean to reevaluate values? Go back and look at all the values that we've held, reevaluate them, to go and redo, like reinterpret our understanding from the ground up of what their worth really is, what their value really is, the value of values. Kind of a obnoxious philosophical turn of phrase, but you know what I mean. So it's not, the reason why this has always been a confusing thing for Jordan is because he thinks of values in this Platonic way, as Platonic ideals, right? But they're not. They're physiological demands for the preservation of a certain way of life that are not arbitrarily placed into the world by fiat. They are tested and what Nietzsche really said that we would have to do is to reevaluate what those values have been. And I mean, this largely involves Nietzsche going and attacking all the values of Christianity and the ways in which they are hostile to life. So again, why not bring that up? That's what Nietzsche said.
On high was now shunted aside. But there's a major problem with that. Many major problems. The psychoanalysts were the first people who really figured this out after Nietzsche. Because imagine that we don't have a relationship with the transcendental anymore that orients us. Okay, now we have to turn to ourselves. Okay, now if we were a unity, a clear unity within ourselves, let's say, then we could turn to ourselves for that discovery.
Yeah, Nietzsche definitely didn't understand that. He definitely thought the individual was a unity. The psychoanalysts were the first to point that out. The psychoanalysts got that from Nietzsche. Freud got that from Nietzsche. Nietzsche says the self is a unity and a multiplicity. He says the soul is not an atom, that the soul, the root of the soul is that which is unconscious. He says the consciousness is a commentary on an unknown text, and that the soul should really be in scientific understanding going forward, reinterpreted as something that is a multiplicity of drives, an oligarchy of drives and desires, that this should have full rights within science. That the psychoanalysts got that from Nietzsche. Does that mean that we can't reevaluate our values? No. That means that before you can, a very Petersonian point, but one which he should know, clean your room before trying to change the world, reevaluate your own values, reevaluate your own, be your own reevaluation of values, embody that, and then you'll reshape that, the world around you in accord with that. But the fact that the self isn't a unity, that it isn't this arbitrarily governing ego consciousness, free will, magic soul idea that acts acausally, acts completely outside of past causes and conditions and everything of who and what you are. Nietzsche didn't hold that, and that doesn't mean that we can't reevaluate our values. If anything, I would say that it would be impossible to have a reevaluation of values if we were an ego soul like that.
But if we're a fractionated plurality internally, then when we turn to ourselves, we turn to a fractionated plurality. Well, that was Freud's observation. It's like,
Got it
well,
from
how
Nietzsche.
can you make your own values when you're not the master in your own house?
Okay, how can you make your own values when you're not the master in your own house? That is, again, identifying you with the ego consciousness. Nietzsche would say what you are is this, the body, the drives themselves. So the drives are master in your house. That is what you are. The consciousness is always trying to deny this. To use Freudian language, because of the superego, because of the demands of society that have imposed this need for feelings, for impulses to be suppressed and displaced by thoughts. And Nietzsche says that's become second nature to us, to the point that a person who acted strictly on their impulses would represent a form of asceticism. We would actually have to stop and think and decide to act on our impulses, because our impulse is to suppress our impulses. Very, again, obnoxious philosophical terms of phrase, but I think you know what I mean. So again, Freud got that from Nietzsche, and he admitted it in his early career. Later on, he tried to deny it, but he even gets the unconsciousness, the id, the it, many of the terms that Nietzsche uses. I did a whole episode on this, the episode on Freud. You can look into it. Freud got that from Nietzsche, Jordan. You should know that.
Like you're a war of competing motivations, or maybe you're someone who's dominated by the will to force and compulsion. And so why do you think that you can rely on yourself as the source of values? And why do you think you're wise enough to consult with yourself to find out what those values are or what they should be, say, in the course of a single life? It's...
Yeah, sure. A lot of people are not qualified to do that. But that doesn't mean no one is. And Nietzsche's not a universalist. And Jordan never has grasped that point. He's not writing to everyone. But again, this surprises me because in the existentialist tradition, I mean, really what Nietzsche's talking about is like the freedom to determine your essence, so to speak, to put it in Sartrean language. Um, and you only get a lifetime to determine that. Throw in a Starship Troopers quote. The freedom to decide for yourself is the only freedom that any of us really have. And unless you're like a Buddhist and you think you're going to be reincarnated like 7 more lifetimes upon entering the stream to figure out what your values will be, most of us only get 1 lifetime, Jordan. So do you figure out for yourself what your values are, what your life means, what your life is going to mean, what it's going to be for, what you're going to sacrifice for, what your ideal will be? Or do you just accept the dogmatic traditions of previous, the I wills that have rigidified and ossified into thou shalts?
It's difficult to organize your own personal relationship, like one relationship in the course of your life, let alone to try to imagine that out of whole cloth you could construct an ethos that would be psychologically and socially stabilizing and last over the long run. It's like, and of course, Marx, people like that, the people who reduce human motivation to a single axis, they had the intellectual hubris to imagine that they could do that. Postmodernists are a good example of that as well.
Okay, but if we lay on the table religion, communism, Nazism, they are all unifying ethos. They're unifying ideas, but they're also horribly dividing ideas. They both unify and divide. Religion has also divided people
Yeah.
because in the nuances of how the different peoples wrestle with God, they have come to different conclusions, and then they use those conclusions, or perhaps the people in power use those conclusions to then start wars, to start hatred, to divide.
Yeah, well, it's one of the key sub themes in the Gospels is the sub theme of the Pharisees, and so the the fundamental enemies of Christ in the Gospels are the Pharisees and the scribes and the lawyers. So, what does that mean? The Pharisees are religious hypocrites. The scribes are academics who worship their own intellect. And the lawyers are the legal minds who use the law as a weapon. And so they're the enemy of the Redeemer. That's a subplot in the gospel stories. And that actually all means something. The Pharisaic problem is that the best of all possible ideas can be used by the worst actors in the worst possible way. And maybe this is an existential conundrum, is that the most evil people use the best possible ideas to the worst possible ends. And then you have the conundrum of how do you separate out, let's say, the genuine religious people from those who use the religious enterprise only for their own machinations.
I mean, this kind of goes beyond Nietzsche at this point, but I guess I would just say I'm probably more worried about people who have genuine religious beliefs than I am about these supposedly insincere people just using religion. As Nietzsche said, the proof that Christians no longer believe as strongly as they used to is that they no longer burn us. Because back in the day, a torture execution wasn't like the execution wasn't the punishment. The pain and suffering you were enduring in the execution was like expurgating your sins so that you could actually be better off in the afterlife. You could go straight to heaven, right? If they broke you on the wheel or if they burned you alive, they thought of themselves as doing you a favor. It's a very it's very backward, right? Like if we have a strictly worldly set of values, if we have reevaluated our values as Nietzsche would, be entirely concerned with the worldly, we would say that's a perversion of logic. You're doing the opposite of anything that's good for that person, quite strictly speaking. And you could only ever get to that conclusion that you were doing them a favor if you were a sincere believer, right? I'm not saying all religion leads to that. I don't really like Lex's argument either. It's very much like the South Park thing that they parodied, right? Like of Richard Dawkins being like, if we got rid of all the religions, then everyone would just live in peace, right? It's the cause of all these wars and everything. And I don't think that's true. I don't really, one of Nietzsche's great insights is that Christianity doesn't create ressentiment. Ressentiment is created, or Christianity is created by ressentiment, right? These religions that are a cult of revenge, it's not like mankind was perfectly healthy and well turned out and powerful and flourishing, and then suddenly he adopted these revenge ideas and they ruined him. It's that these ideas came from people who were resentful and who were sort of they created the cult of revenge out of what was going on within them, out of their own conscious pathologies. And so, you know, I don't the blaming of religion for all these problems. That's never really interested me that much because it's very clear to me that if it wasn't one ideology, it would be another, and that all of these ideas are like post hoc rationalizations for what people already, the values they already hold anyway. So, yeah, I just kind of wanted to make that point.
We're seeing this happen online. Like one of the things that you're seeing happening online, I'm sure you've noticed this, especially on the right wing psychopathic troll side of the distribution, is the weaponization of a certain form of Christian ideation. And that's often marked, at least online, by the presence of, what would you say, cliches like Christ is king, which has a certain religious meaning, but a completely different meaning in this sphere of.
This is like internal infighting in the right. You know, don't let anyone ever tell you there's only left-wing infighting and left-wing purity tests. James Lindsay and people like that show the right wing has their purity tests and their circular firing squads as well. And Jordan's a part of that. You know, so it's not really interesting to those of us who are outside of this whole debate. But I will say it's like the whole Christ is king thing, like, you know, it's actually a great example of Jordan's morality laundering a power game into language that makes it appear acceptable. Like he works for the Daily Wire, incredibly powerful pro-Israel media outlet, and they are currently they're engaged in a sort of ideological war with the anti-Semitic elements of the populist right or the dissident right, whatever the fuck you want to call them, right? Now, I don't really agree with either side in that. I don't identify with either side in that. But it's just funny to me because it's so clear that Jordan's positions here are post hoc rationalizations for the fact that he is part of this like pro-Israel right. And that's why he's like, let me bring up the Christ is king thing to take a shot at these other people. And it's like, is that really, I don't know. It seems to me so clear a laundering of his own morale or of his own, what benefits him, right? Into, you know, morality is the justification for the principles that you want to believe you hold. It's the synthesis of that with what you were going to do anyway. And so again, you can justify power relationships. You can justify the naked use of brute power, brute force through morality, far better than you can by saying that it's all relative and it's all perspectival.
Emerging right-wing pathology, right-wing. The political dimension isn't the right dimension of analysis, but it's definitely the case that the best possible ideas can be used for the worst possible purposes. And that also brings up another specter, which is like, well, is there any reliable and valid way of distinguishing truly beneficial unifying ideas from those that are pathological? And so
I feel like
that's another thing that I tried to
eternally
detail out in these
returned,
lectures, but also in
circled
this new
back
book. It's
the
like,
same
how do you
question he opened
tell
this
the good
video with.
actors from the bad actors at the most fundamental level of analysis?
And good ideas from the bad ideas, and you lecture on truth that Nietzsche also struggled with. So how do you know that communism is a bad idea versus it's a good idea implemented by bad actors?
Right. That's a more subtle variant of the.
Sometimes Lex's questions are just something else. I think I've been talking for for too long here, probably already, and it seems like they've kind of moved off the topic of Nietzsche. I think they might circle back to him a little bit, but I think we'll call it here. I think I answered really the main things I wanted to talk about. So if there are any other clips of Jordan or anyone else talking about Nietzsche that you'd like me to respond to, let me know in the comments, and I will consider it. But that's my take on this. So, all right. Cheers, y'all. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.